sector and the private sector with responsibility for achieving outcomes. We absolutely reject the archetypal top-down technical approach to corruption reform, and we also reject the idea that corruption is just one thing that can be captured in the notion of there being an amount of corruption that can be identified in terms of how much there is in a given setting, usually a nation state. And essentially the book is an attempt to reflect all our thinking around these approaches over many years. It's explicitly practical. It offers a way to identify issues, to prioritize them, to examine the what and the how to address and limit opposition, and so forth. So the reform concept is essentially move molehills, not mountains. Break big problems down into smaller, more manageable ones. Corruption as a management issue is something that can be best approached if you break it down into identifiable specific problems. And what we do is set out the approach, which is called the SFRA approach, sector focus remediation action. What the approach does is identify the sectors. It tells you, it gives you guidance on how to focus in on specific issues. It offers guidance on identifying possible remediation measures, and then on how to decide on specific action. So one of the things that we stress, and we quote Michael Johnston here, is that you've got to break corruption down into manageable specific issues. As Michael says, telling people to forget about whole country measurements and rankings and instead to focus on sectors and specific problems within them is essential advice. My experience with a variety of audiences is that you can't tell people that sort of thing too often, as without constant prodding and reminders, they'll drift back towards more corruption versus less corruption, full stop, and towards biting off the entire problem all at once rather than breaking it down in sectoral and operational ways. So this is intensely practical about what you do to break corruption down into more manageable sizes. Why sectors? Well, we think sectors are particularly a good place to focus on reform efforts. Sectors are the places where those who work within them understand the issues and the drivers within them. They understand the language, the social norms, the political specificities. You can get a real sense of what the real issues are within a sector, which is much more difficult to do at a more macro level. So sectors allows you to understand the specifics of the corruption issues you're trying to deal with. We look at sectors in what in the academic parlance is sometimes called an epistemic community. So those within it understand it, but those who are outside it have much more difficulty in getting to the heart of it. It allows you to work with the grain of the issues to get a proper understanding of what corruption means in specific contexts, where it matters, how it matters within an organization. And we make the claim, we think we can evidence it, that corruption may have similarities in different sectors, but the specific manifestations of corruption are often very sector specific, even if the broader issue that is being dealt with looks superficially similar. But the core issue that we address, what we really try to talk about in the book, is the importance of those who are in these positions of responsibilities within organizations to take responsibility for dealing with corruption. And one of the things we have found too often when talking to people who are aware of corruption issues in a particular setting or sector is that they know about it, but they don't want to deal with it. They don't want to address it. And one of the phrases that we've heard many times is, it's not my responsibility. Well, we argue it is. It's absolutely the responsibility of people in senior managerial positions within organizations, companies, etc., to address corruption if it's preventing the proper purpose of those organizations and companies being achieved. So what do we mean by sector? Well, we've given a fairly, I'm not going to read this all out because it's far too long to do it, but we've got a fairly clear definition of sectors as being the individual structures and functions through which national life operates. And we talk about the functions, what they look like, where they are. And we also talk about the need for sectors to have professions, a government ministry, multiple government organizations and agencies, commercial organizations, relevant industry associations, etc. So there's a clear sense of what delineates one sector from another. And then we provide a table which is not completely inclusive of every sector that anybody could identify, but gives you an idea of what are some of the main sectors that we're talking about. And we go from politics through security, public order, public services, financial sectors, natural resources, etc. So it's fairly clear, I hope, when we talk about sectors, what we mean by sectors and what some of them look like that we're dealing with and addressing in the book. So sector, focus, remediation, action. Sector is the starting point. You focus, you choose the sector, and then you need to focus on the particular issue. And how do you do that? Well, we say that the first thing you need to do is disaggregate specific issues and problems. You've got to get away from the idea that there is just this thing called corruption. There are always particular issues that need to be addressed. And that means avoiding generalities is really important. You've got to focus on identifiable problems that can be addressed. And we give some ideas as to how to go about doing that. We say that one very useful way of doing that is to have typologies, to build typologies of corruption types within different sectors. So here you've got a couple of examples, one from health, one from police. And as you can see, these are broken down under broad headings like health functions, leadership and governance, workforce, medical products, and then under that, a series of specific different corruption issues. So there's 43 listed here for health, and there's 34 listed for police sectors. And what we say is that for any sector, you can identify a whole series of specific corruption-related issues, which the people working within that sector will be able to recognize. They'll say, or they'll understand, yeah, these are the relevant issues in this particular sector. So what we argue is that having disaggregated into these sectors, and there's a whole series of different typologies. I've just shown two on the screen there, but you know, in the book there's about another 4 or 5. There's a whole series of them on the curbingcorruption.com website. There are others that you get. U4 have done similar typologies. So these exist, but they can also be developed from within any given sector. But having done that, then you need to analyze what's actually going on with the specific issues. So you can identify the issues, but you really want some way of homing in to understand why and how these issues are taking place in the way that they are within the specific sector that you're looking at. And again, we recommend that you use a whole series of existing methodologies. There's quite a lot of them, some of them put together by the World Bank, things like the vulnerability to corruption analysis approach, or public expenditure tracking surveys. These are mechanisms which allow you to understand what the process is that is leading to the corruption issue that you want to address. We also very strongly recommend that you engage in political economy analysis, and the book provides a whole series of guides to how you can go about that, what you should look at, what kinds of questions need to be asked. So the focus element of the sector focus remediation approach is about getting down to the specifics of particular corruption issues and understanding what's driving them, what's bringing them about. And the purpose of that is to build a shared understanding so that everybody's essentially on the same page. We talk about this notion of sense making. There's a kind of large literature around this. It's how do you get people to build or come to a shared understanding of their collective experience? And that's important because often if you speak to people at different levels of an organization, they have very different understandings of what the issues are, not just corruption, but we're talking about corruption, but a whole series of issues. You get different responses at different levels. So one of the things we recommend is actually getting people together to talk about it. And we give an example here. This is work that Mark Pyman did in Botswana, working with defense leaders. You put to get people together in a room, it can be quite uncomfortable. In many settings, you're dealing with people who they know that they are involved in some of the corruption. They know that you know that they're involved in some of the corruption, but you can, if you allow people to talk about these things, you can get to a position of identifying core issues. If you're particularly in sensitive settings, if you allow people to discuss things, but then vote on a list of possible issues in terms of ranking their importance, but vote secretly, as it were, you can get a clear identification of what people think are the most important issues. And here we can see in Botswana, the discussion led to payrolls, promotions, appointments and rewards, and control of the intelligence services as being the issues that most people identified as these are the really important ones. It doesn't mean that those are necessarily the ones you're going to tackle or address, but it gives you an idea of what the people in the sector think are the pressing issues, the most significant ones. And that allows you to identify areas which you might think are useful ways to start your action against corruption. So how do you go about that? Well, we move on to talk about remediation. And remediation, by this we mean adopting strategies to get things done. Adopting ways that are going to have a tangible effect. Approaches that are impossible or simply a statement of desire do not constitute strategies. So, you know, if you say what we need is greater commitment from top leaders to tackle corruption, that's not a strategy, that's just a wish. So what we're talking about is identifying strategies where what you have to do is identify the potential conflict, the likely resistance, where interests lie, who's got the most power, what are you going to do to address those kinds of issues. So strategy entails an understanding that you've got to get to some form of resolution of those kinds of conflictual issues. And we offer two ways of going about that. On the one hand, a broad framing approach, which is looking at the political context, making judgments about how things are changed, what the sequencing might be, etc., and then detailed improvement measures. So these are specific options that can be explored either on their own or in combination with others. And so the idea, as as I say, is to generate plausible possibilities, not to take specific actions. At this stage, we're not deciding what we're going to do. We're simply trying to outline what are the possible options, what are the possible ways forward, and why might they be useful. And we can give some examples. So the book is full of examples of these kinds of approaches. So in terms of broad framing, it's about trying to find how local circumstances can be navigated, and we offer 9 different options, from single issue framing to broad front, low profile, bundling, etc. I'll give a couple of examples of these so you get a sense. So a single issue example, this was the Maersk shipping company, which had a problem with their captains having to pay significant bribes when they pulled into ports around various parts of the world. And what they did was to adopt a tripartite strategy to address this. One was to work directly with the captains to explain to them that although from the individual captain's point of view, the paying of a small bribe didn't seem to be a particular big issue, that from the company's point of view, as this was accumulated across all their different ships, it became a huge issue. So for each individual captain, there was training on doing this. So they then insisted that every captain should report wherever they were asked to pay a bribe. They then worked with local port authorities, and they set up an IT system to track where bribes were being asked for most often, and were able to then institute reforms in those particular ports. And you can see there's an absolutely dramatic resolution of the issue when they were able to identify where the problem was happening, who was involved, and put in place remedial action. So that's an example of a single issue. A narrow front example, there's a whole series in the book here. Electricity provision in Kenya and Ghana. Again, we describe in the book the kinds of problem-solving measures that were taken to address this. And then a bundling example, which is quite apposite, I guess, in the light of the last couple of days, but an attempt to address voting fraud, corruption, by rolling it in with a series of other reforms. And we use the example of the so-called badass grandmas from North Dakota, who were able to build in some specific anti-corruption legislation as part of a wider range of reforms. So these are fairly well recognized from anybody that's looked at policy processes in politics. The second element of remediation is the identification of measures that can be undertaken. It aims to address 2 common mistakes that people make about corruption. First, it counters the idea that anti-corruption is about the consequences of corruption. That, you know, when you talk about anti-corruption, you should focus on punishing the people caught for doing it, or trying to do something about discovering corruption and then acting. We argue that actually it's much more effective to focus your efforts on stopping the corruption happening in the first place. So prevention is a key part of this. And then the second mistake is this idea that it is somebody else's problem, that it is somebody else who has to deal with it. That if you come across corruption, or you discover corruption in the setting that you're working with, you simply report it to somebody else, or you don't do anything at all because it's not your problem. We argue that it is, and that people who are in these positions should do something about it. And we list in the book, we provide 8 categories of so-called improvement measures. We offer 64 subcategories and 65 concrete examples of how these work in practice. And these are the categories: functional, people-centered, transparency measures, etc. And again, we give some examples. monitoring improvement measures where, for instance, you could commission corruption-focused audits and reviews, or you could look at citizen report cards if you're in a public-facing setting where you need people to tell you what's going on. You can use international peer review mechanisms, but these are monitoring improvement measures as one form of improvement approach. We give an example from the Netherlands. Another example, integrity improvement measures, establish an integrity unit within the organization, or be more explicit in terms of training the leadership of an organization or a company in integrity and anti-corruption, introduce notions of integrity via internal media, etc. Or another approach is in incentive and nudge improvement measures. These are very popular in many areas. So things like using public commitments, committing publicly to doing things in a certain way. There's some research evidence to suggest that, if you have an honesty box, even just putting a pair of eyes above it makes people more likely to use it. Using signs like saying thank you for your honesty helps, getting people to sign at the start of the form that they're going to fill it in truthfully rather than at the end of the form. So these familiar types of nudge measures. So there are a whole series, as I say, we've got 8 categories of these remediation measures. But that's not the point at which you make decisions. So the next section in the book is on action. So how do you decide on the concrete measures to take? This is a 2-step process. And so what we say is, first of all, you have to identify the feasible options. You can set out combinations of broad framing and possible detailed measures. And so we've got this, what we call the SFRA matrix, which just happens to look like a chessboard because we've got the 8 broad framing measures and the specific measures. And then we say that by using that combination, you then should take a series of different lenses to look at them, to examine the merits and the drawbacks of specific combinations of measures. But one important thing here is that what we're not saying, absolutely not saying, is that you can identify what is the best practice. And we absolutely accept that what works in one setting might not work in another setting because of different contextual factors that are going on. So there isn't ever a situation in which there is an answer that you can get to. There are possibilities. So this is in the line of there are many ways to skin a cat. There are potentially many different ways to get to the desired end. And if you look at some of the examples that we use in the book, you can plot them against these various different elements of the matrix. So some of them, reforms in Bulgarian defense use functional improvements on a broad front and transparency measures. The reforms in the Greek health system had functional improvements like a low profile approach, but also monitoring measures, which were much more about keeping up hope because of the scale of the issue. And so we set out a range of different possibilities in terms of how you can identify the relationship between the broad framing and the specific measures. And we suggest that you use a series of lenses to identify what would be best. So the lenses allow you to consider things like, how do you present and frame the approach? How complex will it be? What's going to happen when people react against it? Who are the winners and who are the losers? How does it fit with other things that are going on? And so by doing that, by stepping back and looking at it through these different lenses, it allows for a better assessment of which options are more realistic than others. And so the lenses, we provide, again, 10 lenses: dialectical, branding, politics and power, time frame, etc. This shows you different ways, different elements that need to be considered when addressing this. So a dialectical lens would be, for instance, do you decide between a preventative or a disciplinary strategy, not a discipling strategy. Do you prioritize fighting corruption or building integrity? Do you take a narrow or a broad focus? So putting kind of opposite ideas together to assess what would be most appropriate. And, you know, politics and power lens, for instance, here, this is an example taken from our sister program, and indeed Mushtaq Khan, who will be giving the next seminar in this series, his work with Pallavi, Roy and others, to look at who are the winners and losers, how will political will vary between options, what national regime types may favor in terms of some possibilities over others. So really step back and think, well, in the context within which we're working, given all the various different factors that we've looked at, how will these different things affect the potential choice that we make? By doing that, we argue that you can get to a point where not only have you identified specific corruption issues in particular settings that you can get shared agreement on in regard to how significant they are, but also that you can, by taking the steps that we suggest, identify appropriate measures, assess whether they're likely to have a chance of success or not, understand why you are taking this measure as opposed to that measure, and have a reason, have a structured, strategic reason for choosing one particular kind of action over another. And so the key reflection that I'll leave you with is that by recasting larger problems into smaller, less arousing ones, people can identify a series of controllable opportunities with modest size that produce visible results and can be gathered into synoptic solutions. So this is from Carol Weick, who's an organizational theorist in the United States. And so it's all about how you deal with the big problems like corruption is and make them more manageable in such a way as you can actually have some hope or some chance of being able to identify specific actionable measures that will make a difference. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you very much. So Paul, this book is very much aimed at practitioners, and we have a practitioner with us as a discussant today. So we have Andrew Heywood with us. Andrew's the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at Subsea 7, which is an engineering company which does underwater engineering. Andrew is a friend of Sussex who has been down to talk to our Masters in Corruption and Governance students before, particularly about his book, which is a business guide to effective compliance. And Andrew is a great discussant for this, not just because of his current role, but also because he's previously been in senior compliance roles in two different sectors, in pharmaceuticals, as well as in construction. So Andrew is going to give us a few reflections and comments just for about 5 minutes. And after that, we'll open up to questions from others in the audience. So do, again, drop your questions in the chat if you have them. But for now, we will hear from Andrew Heywood. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Liz. I hope you can hear me, I trust.
We can.
Good. Thank you very much. And thank you to for the invitation to speak. Paul, very nice to see you. I'm sorry that my previous meeting overran and we didn't get to speak before the call, but I must say I have enjoyed looking through your book and also hearing your remarks. So this is, as Liz said, I just intend to throw out a few reflections, some of which may obviously stimulate comments or lines of discussion. So, so as someone who's worked as a Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer in 3 sectors, I fully agree with Paul that focus on your own sector and you have a better understanding of the risks and issues and can act collectively with greater influence. Which sectors, as Liz said, is pharmaceuticals, then construction, and then offshore energy, deep sea oil and gas. And I think if you do work across sectors, it can enable you to learn from other sectors that are more mature or have useful analogues and potentially see your own risks and issues in a different light or adapt their solutions to your sector. And one example of this would be in pharmaceuticals, they developed protocols to follow if you needed to invite a public official to inspect your plant. How would you make sure that was done in an appropriate way? And this is less of a common issue in offshore energy, but it might apply, for example, if you're having a vessel inspected offshore prior to it entering a country. So I'd say in my case, my current role in oil and gas is somewhat similar to construction, but more mature. So I would not say I brought much from construction to oil and gas in terms of understanding risks, but I had looked at similar country risks, and the opposite would not be true. So moving from oil and gas to construction would be useful. A lot of knowledge from my earlier experience in pharmaceuticals, bizarrely, was also useful, partly because that sector was so mature, and also because comparing construction or oil and gas risks with pharmaceutical risks revealed some parallels and some adaptable solutions. Collective action across sectors, as opposed to within a sector, might be possible, in which case it might prove more effective, but it would have to relate to a common issue, as Paul says. I suppose something like customs could be such a thing. Companies in different sectors could be having fundamentally similar issues with customs in a country. A good example, I think, of tackling the molehill to which Paul refers, and not the mountain, would be this. Don't try to change the law in a country to require electronic payments whenever possible. Even across sectors, that is too big an ask, and it's for democratically elected representatives to decide if they want their country to go non-cash for a range of public policy reasons, not just because it reduces corruption opportunities and helps companies face fewer bribe demands. That's a real example, which is why I've plucked that. As a private sector company, tackling the supply side of bribery is obviously more within your control, rather than tackling the demand side, at least in terms of preventing your own organization from paying bribes. So focus on what you can control or what you can impact is another aspect of what Paul is saying, really. You may be able to do this across your sector if you have enough influence as a company, or if you can reassure your peers through industry associations on best practice forums that you all have shared goals. And a nice example of this I recall was with Pfizer. When I was in the pharmaceutical industry, which is now more than 15 years ago, there was still very much the practice of inviting doctors to attend symposiums, pay for them to have a nice week, stay in a nice hotel, hear these talks that were effectively an opportunity to promote your product. And pharmaceutical companies could see that this was not a particularly proper approach. It was quite risky, but they all felt if we're the first mover, we will simply lose so much share of voice. It will have a rather Pyrrhic victory. We'll be able to say we're the most ethical and least profitable, i.e. least sustainable pharmaceutical company. But when Pfizer, with their particularly strong position, made the first move, other companies thought they would then be able to follow suit. So in that example, it was a cross-sector thing, but it took, in a way, the biggest player to make the first move. And then perhaps the broadest example of breaking corruption down into issues is to focus on bribery, as many countries have done when implementing their UN anti-corruption convention commitments. But of course, that is still a very broad topic. And I think, Paul, often you're talking indeed about that still broad topic. Within an organization, I think you have to break it down further into specific bribery and corruption risks to ensure people understand them and are equipped to recognize and resist or report, and to ensure, of course, that you have the right policies and procedures to manage those risks. Some might be dealt with just by policies and training, such as the facilitation payment risk, which is best illustrated by the vessel example that you gave, Paul. Others might be managed via a procedure or a control, such as making it impossible to get your hands on any petty cash, which would be relevant to the vessel facilitation payment, admittedly, or making it impossible to appoint a supplier without a competitive tender and a robust procurement process. Abuse of local content laws might be a good example of a topic that can best be addressed across sectors. But again, a company can seek to address the supply side via due diligence and vigilance. So if you're operating in a country where local content laws, hopefully for good reasons, try and require you to work with local partners or suppliers, sometimes that can be abused as a channel for illicit enrichment. And obviously that's across sectors, you might all be facing that same shift and try to face it. So last couple of reflections. I think oil and gas is a very mature anti-bribery, anti-corruption sector. but many of the companies at the top of the food chain in this sector have tended to address it as a legal obligation or liability to be managed by pushing the liability down the supply chain contractually and trying to hold the main contractor liable for bribery further down the supply chain, rather than treating it as a shared issue like health and safety. And I know Paul touched on health and safety as well. So in our sector, health and safety, the approach has been to sort of foster a sort of collaborative, transparent approach, rather than just push the issue down the supply chain. But I'd say that at least anti-bribery in oil and gas is led by the clients at the top of the food chain, which means we have a better chance of acting collectively in terms of best practice and tackling the supply side, and indeed a better chance of tackling the demand side. And funny enough, that contrasts with construction. Admittedly, I'm talking 10 years ago and things might have changed, but I found that public sector clients in the construction sector, although they would profess that this was a key topic, really they just wanted to know that you had a code of conduct and that was the box ticked, and that was really the end of it. So I think just finally, Paul quite rightly notes how safety is a very useful parallel in other ways too. And I've definitely found that in sectors that have significant safety issues. And interestingly, if you're in a sector that doesn't have significant safety issues, I've found that quality management systems are also a useful parallel. So I'm going to pause there because I could go on, and I want to make sure Paul and others got a chance to respond to some of those things. I was going to finish somewhat wryly by saying, although I've not worked in defence, I was intrigued to see that offsets was one of the topics with the lowest number of votes on Paul's slides. And then finally, just to give a vote for behavioural economics and nudge theory that Paul was mentioning there. That's certainly a key part of our programme, because we're very, and you will see this in my book, which is that a lot of people are not motivated by obedience to a policy or even obedience to a law. And this is another point that Paul was really getting at. You've got to find what motivates them, whether it's showing them the harm that's caused by corruption or showing them how what we're trying to do aligns with their own values and their own integrity. So I'll pause there, but I'm very happy to respond or join in the debate on any of those themes, or more particularly the themes that Paul has raised.
That's great. Thanks very much, Andrew. Do you want to respond to that, Paul, or should we take some of the questions?
Should we take some
okay.
questions?
So there are a couple of questions which are a bit similar, which we might take first. So one question from Abdiwali. He says, one of the examples you used was about Burundi, a post-conflict country. What do you think works in fragile and post-conflict countries in tackling corruption? There is also one asking about what is from NIMAT, asking what's the interlinkage between foreign aid and corruption, especially in post-conflict countries like Afghanistan. And there's also one which says, could you say something more about navigating power relations within sectors? And this is from someone who works in military defence arms issues, and says it's quite difficult to set aside the political and economic interests that support corruption, including here in the UK. So any advice there? So it's sort of cluster around conflict and arms.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Thanks for the questions, and thanks for the reflections, Andrew, which I found very helpful and insightful, and particularly I think some of the issues around collective action and working across sectors. That's not something we particularly have dealt with. Well, it's not something we've dealt with in the book, and I think it is something where there is scope to do an awful lot more. I think that, I was pleased to hear that quite a lot of what we were saying resonated with your own experience, and particularly things like, you're focusing on what you can control and what you can impact, and not trying to, take on aspirations which are just impossible to achieve. Requiring a law change to allow electronic payments is a great example of that. So it's good to hear that. I think it's important that we step back and maybe reflect a bit more on what we could say about cross-sector learning. I think that's really helpful in terms of the particular questions. So in a sense, the whole approach of the book is designed not to be able to give an answer to some of those questions, so that, you know, in terms of, you know, what would you do in regard to the post-conflict situation in somewhere like Burundi? Well, the answer is I couldn't possibly answer that unless you talk about the specifics of what the issues are that you are trying to address. That's the whole point of saying that there aren't sort of, you know, predetermined or prejudged solutions. There isn't necessarily a way of saying that in these certain circumstances, this is what needs to be done, because in what could be ostensibly similar circumstances in different settings, you might need to do very different things depending precisely on what the local power relationships are, what the constellation of actors are, where the resistance is likely to arise. So, you know, the kinds of questions along the lines of what would you do in situation X can only be answered by saying, well, I need to understand more about what situation X actually entails in some detail. What's the specific issue that you're trying to address? Similarly, with, you know, the relationship between foreign aid and corruption, for sure, there is a relationship between foreign aid and corruption, but it's going to be different in different settings and different contexts. And so rather than talk generically, and this is, I think if there's one thing that we want to get away from, it's the idea that with corruption problems, you can identify sensibly or meaningfully, you know, the 3 key things you need to do, or the 5 steps that need to be taken to stop X. We just don't believe that that's ever a particularly useful or helpful approach. What we're trying to say is you need to identify much more specifically the problem that you're trying to address. Foreign aid and its relationship to corruption is too broad an issue to be able to give a meaningful answer to that particular question. One other thing I should add, and I should have mentioned this right at the very start of the talk. There's all kinds of things which this book isn't remotely attempting to address. You know, the really big issues. You know, if you're dealing with, you know, state capture, if you're dealing with, you know, the judiciary that has been completely corrupted, we don't have answers. We're not trying to answer that kind of question in this book. That's not what this is about. This is about trying to identify specific problems in contexts where people can actually make a difference. The bigger problems are indeed very real problems. We do give some tips and advice in the book on how you survive in those kinds of settings, but that's not what we're trying to do.
Great. So another question we have in the chat from Robin Lewis, saying you referred in the beginning to Michael Johnston. Of course, we all know that he authored the concept of syndromes of corruption. How do you sort of integrate that work into this approach, or do you integrate that work into this approach?
Yeah, so again, it's similar to the comment that I've just made about, you know, the level at which you're operating. So we're not addressing corruption as a national level phenomenon. You know, Michael Johnston, whose work I massively admire, and I think the Syndromes of Corruption book is, you know, it's a really important book. But what he's doing there is trying to give a sort of synoptic overview of levels of corruption at, you know, country level across a range of different types of states. How we would deal with that in relation to how this works is, well, depending where you are, you know, if you're in the particular kind of setting that is described in broad terms in Michael Johnston's work, well, then you need to still identify what's the specific problem that you're trying to address. How does the broader setting influence that? That's why we talk quite a lot in the book about diagnosis, about political economy approaches, about trying to disaggregate and understand what the dynamics are of the corruption. So, you know, again, a plea to get away from the kind of broad view of this country has this kind of corruption, and that's what we need to address. We're not really interested in that level of analysis. We're interested in digging down to the specifics of particular corruption problems and issues. And obviously, depending on which of the sort of four modal regime types of corruption that Johnston identifies, your response would be appropriate to wherever you sit within that, within the particular organization or company that you're working in.
So another question then from the chat is around, what's the difference between this approach and a systems analysis approach? And this is from Ugan, one of our current MA students who's from Uzbekistan, and they were planning to use the systems analysis approach to think about analysing corruption in the prosecution service. So any comments on the differences?
So, systems analysis, you could say, has similarities with this, but so a lot of systems analysis approaches are about trying to identify the kind of various different factors that lead to the particular issue that you're dealing with. We go further than that in that we try to provide ways of honing in on a particular issue. So the systems analysis is trying to understand the systemic framework, but doesn't go so far in terms of, if you're dealing with this particular issue, these are the steps that you should think about taking. So, there is a parallel, a sort of a broad similarity, but I think we're much more kind of concrete, specific, structured and focused in terms of these are the steps you can take, and this is how you can get to the point of deciding which steps would be more appropriate. Whereas I think systems analysis on the whole tends to be a bit further back in terms of its kind of overview of situations without providing the kind of the concrete route forward.
Great. Yes, so in the room, we also have an audience. We have a question, I think, in the room from Maman.
Yeah, appreciating the idea, focusing on the better understanding of specific problem. My question is, does it work when pattern of corruption become changing day by day or time to time? Because those who are the culprit or perpetrators of corruption or money laundering, they change their pattern day by day, such as in my country, Hindi or money laundering. Such as currently there is a systems. The day after tomorrow, the systems will be changed. They developed a new idea. So your approach, does it connect something? And also in the banking sector or bribery, they change their pattern of bribery due to the different. They try to innovative in bribery mechanism, or in banking they also, such as in 5 years ago, whatever we indicate that this kind of problem is a specific problem in banking fraud. However, the current pattern is totally different. They used the modern technology, modern tools to get it like something.
Yeah.
So does your approach adjust the changing patterns of corruption?
So we don't address that specifically in the book.
Yeah, sector-based just idea.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. Of course, we know that the modalities of corruption change and adapt all the time. And, whether it's kind of the whack-a-mole idea that, Liz has written about, if you address corruption in this area, is it simply just, diverted to different forms of corruption in another area? These are real problems. And of course, anybody, if they are intent on defrauding a system or getting unfair advantage, they're going to find whatever way they can do it. So if you are able to close the loophole that prevents them doing it in this setting, they'll then try to find another way of doing it. That's clearly true. The answer to that would be, well, yes, you use the same approach to address the new problem. So if by, changing from one style of engaging in bribery to another style, because the first one has been, effectively challenged, then, okay, you need to look at what's happening now, and you go back through the same process to say, all right, what are the steps that we need to take in order to address this new challenge? And of course, then new ones will arrive all the time, because, let's be frank, we are never, ever going to get rid of corruption. It's just not going to happen. So there's always going to be the challenge of addressing the particular corruption issues, but the essential approach remains the same, whether the nature of corruption or the people engaged in it move from one form of it to another, which you would expect them to do.
So sadly, that brings us to the end of the session, far too quickly, but this has been a really great discussion. Thanks very much, Paul. Thanks to everybody who came. Do remember that the next in our ACE seminar series is on December the 5th with Sarah Hussain and Mushtaq Khan at SOAS, chaired by Pallavi Roy, talking about Bangladesh and the Monsoon Revolution. But for now, a really big thank you to Paul and Andrew for today's session. Thank you.
Thank you.